let me share the correct screen. And then let me hit, oh, I can't see it because the Zoom thing. I'm sure everybody has done that. All right, how's it look?
Good.
Fantastic. All right, so welcome to my talk, How to JSON API Quickly and Easily in Laravel. A few notes ahead of time. Number one, I talk fast, and this covers an incredible amount of content. It actually covered way more, and I extracted a whole bunch of it out. It's to the point where there's like multiple blog posts worth of content sitting in my notes, and I actually spent a whole bunch of today taking a whole bunch of that content and putting it in to a website, which I will post at the end of this. That website will also include these slides as soon as I make them live on SpeakerDeck, so don't worry about having to take lots of notes. And like I said, I talk really fast. There's a lot of content. Expect to go back and watch this later. Expect to go back to this website later, go back to my slides later. Don't feel like you have to take it all in now. Just kind of do like fire hose type thing. So that's it kind of for the talk. You're probably coming in with some level of knowledge of JSON API. Don't worry about it. I'll kind of cover it from the base. But let's just kind of dive right into it. So you probably have seen the title of this talk on the Laracon schedule, How to JSON API Quickly and Easily in Laravel. And people have been sending me these tweets being like, ooh, I've used it before, and I can't wait to see how you solve this problem or that problem. And of course, the promise of quickly and easily is really great here. So I'm going to just say kind of, here's my talk right here. You can't, the end. You can't, and what I mean by that is my original talk was going to be finding the absolute best way to do JSON API. I knew there was a lot of different ways, and I was going to teach you. I was going to say, here's the best way, and I'm going to make it quick, and I'm going to make it easy. I'm good at that, right? Taking complicated problems and turning them into relatively simple solutions. The problem is, in all my diving into this, what I learned was there is no one best way. And so that's an impossible talk to give. I literally can't give that talk. And I instead have basically realized that there's a different talk that I need to give. And I rewrote my entire talk from scratch. And understanding what's best for you and your circumstance at any particular moment requires knowing way more than just implementation details. And the original talk was going to be implementation details. And it turns out that we need a lot more than that. So this is the new talk, getting to JSON API, what it is, why you should use it, and how to use it in Laravel. I will just tell you ahead of time, if you're really looking forward to implementation details, those were the easiest pieces to pull out to content on the website. So the implementation details will be there, but they'll be a little bit more sparse than you might expect from the original title. But don't worry, I'm going to get you covered with all that. But this is going to teach you more about what it is, so that when you're implementing and when you're making decisions about how to implement and what to implement, you're going to be so prepared, not just for JSON API, but for every API you build after this. So the first half of my talk is theory. We're going to start talking about REST APIs, the general state of APIs right now, what JSON API is and why I think you should use it. And then the second half is implementation a little bit more broadly. So what JSON API tools are available to you in Laravel, some other concerns for APIs, and then some things for you to think about doing after the talk and a quick outro. You might be wondering, if I was supposed to be giving this amazing implementation talk, why are you giving me the intro to REST APIs? And it's because in order to know how to implement JSON API, what JSON API is about, the ways that people tend to misunderstand it, and the things we can learn from it, we need to go further back in the stack than I expected. And I thought it would be as just kind of teaching. I said, oh, I'm going to give an implementation talk. Oops, got to teach about a JSON API in order to give that implementation talk. And it turns out I actually had to go a step further and talk about what are APIs. So you've probably, as a Laravel programmer, built dozens of REST APIs, right? And REST for us tends to be CRUD over JSON using HTTP verbs. And we tend to think, oh, well, it's REST, therefore we're going to use URLs like /dog/14. Or maybe if we're really feeling spicy, we might do /articles /14/comments. And, using the correct HTTP verbs or whatever. And that's actually a really good move in the right direction, but that's not exactly what REST is. So it turns out that REST is actually a very well-defined academic concept, and it means representational state transfer. And you may have heard that before, and like me, not actually thought about what that really means. So what it means is representing a resource. A resource is anything, a dog or a blog post or whatever, as some kind of text. It doesn't have to be JSON. It could be XML or whatever else, and transferring it to and from the end user. And the state, meaning kind of like, in what state is this dog? Is its name Fido, or is its name Pickles or whatever, something like that? That's the state, and you're representing that state not by moving the actual resource around, but by moving around representations or JSON objects or whatever else they're going to be. It was originally introduced by this handsome fellow, Roy Fielding, who was one of the principal authors of the HTTP spec and also one of the co-founders of Apache. And he actually developed the ideas of REST alongside the development of HTTP. HTTP was originally a little bit more flexible. And one of the things they did as they were starting to pin it down was interview people to make sure they had really thought through all of their thoughts and implications of their lives, or HTTP on their lives. And so as they were doing that, he started coming to maybe a next level thinking about how he wanted computers to talk to each other on the internet. And that's kind of what REST was. So he had a dissertation in 2000 where he introduced it. And this is what he talked about. And most of these are either stuff we already do or stuff that's pretty easy for you to introduce. So I'm just going to kind of blaze through these. It's client to server, great. It's stateless, which is why, for example, in Laravel, you have to send the API token along with every single request rather than relying on the session. You don't have session from one request to another. Each request has to individually kind of encapsulate what it's doing. It's cacheable. Okay, cool. It's layered, which is an interesting specification, but it makes sense. It just means that the consumer shouldn't know whether they're getting access to your original server or a proxy or a load balancer. They should all be exactly the same, which is great. And then it has a uniform interface. You've probably heard of uniform resource locators, URLs, uniform resource, I'm trying to remember, identifiers, URIs. They're all kind of that same thing. And this is where this stuff ties back into the core of HTTP. And so what he means by that is resource identification requests, which really just means every request I make should identify the resources I'm trying to get, which is exactly what URLs do. I want to go to myapi.com/dogs. Well, then that identifies that I'm looking for all the resources within the dogs type. Great. Or /log/14, dog with the ID of 14. Cool. So it's identified. Nice and easy. Resource manipulation through representations. That sounds a little bit scarier, but all that means is if I want to change dog number 14 from name Fido to name Pickles, then I need to pass a representation of dog number 14 with the new information into a certain endpoint, the edit endpoint with a certain verb, right? So all I'm doing is taking that maybe JSON or XML representation of this particular resource, modifying it, and then sending it somewhere, and that's how modification happens. Cool, still makes sense. Self-descriptive messages just means that your responses that come back are teaching the consumer how to interpret themselves, which is exactly what the content type in our HTTP request is for. Totally fine. As long as you use your content type correctly, you've followed this one. And then, ding, 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 hypermedia as the engine of application state. We'll get to that one in a bit. Don't worry if it's overwhelming. And it may be overwhelming because you don't know what it means, or it may be overwhelming because you've learned about it once, and that makes it even more overwhelming. Don't worry about it. We'll dig into it. Three common things. These aren't actually the misconceptions. These are the answers to the misconceptions. There are no actual defined URL patterns for REST. Of course, there's some good practices that folks in our community like to recommend, and I love them, but REST doesn't actually care. REST doesn't have to be JSON. And most APIs that we call REST are really REST-ish. They're not actually REST. But that's okay. That's not a big deal. My purpose with this talk is not to make you feel like you must do REST, but it's good for us to know these things because it can help us understand maybe there's some pieces we should be using. But even if not, we should make the decision not to implement something out of the knowledge of the something, not because we're completely ignorant of it. So let's talk about that last one. Hadous. I like to call it Hadios just because I get this image in my head and it gives me an excuse to spend 15 minutes making this Photoshop instead of working on my talk when I'm procrastinating. And what it is, again, is hypermedia as the engine of application state. It's one of the least commonly fulfilled requirements of REST. What it means is these responses are going to contain hypermedia, which are going to give you directions for how to modify the state of your application. So that means every single time you get a response back from a REST API, it should have directions in it in the shape of hypermedia, and those directions will teach you how to modify the state. So then you ask the question, well, Matt, what's hypermedia? Hypermedia is any content that has links to other forms of media. And this sounds probably familiar to you because HTTP is hypertext transfer protocol. Hypermedia and hypertext are basically the same thing. And if you have ever been around the worlds of hypercards back in the old days in the Mac or anything like that, this is all very old school, very early thinking about how computers can allow us to navigate through them. And so just like hypercard allowed us to build these things where it's sort of like choose your own adventure, right? It gives you, here are the 3 things you can possibly do, and you tap on one of them and that takes you somewhere else. Hypermedia is the same thing. Here's the 3 things you can do with dog number 14. Edit, view, and delete, maybe. So you got 3 pieces of your hypermedia that are telling you the 3 adventures that you can choose with Fido, dog number 14, and that's hypermedia. So here's an example of a response, just the simplest possible response that you might get back from JSON API. The type is departments, the ID is 10, and one attribute is that it's the IT department. Okay, cool. So if you're going to send embedded hypermedia back with this, this is what it would look like. You'd add a new thing called links, and it would have either one thing, sometimes it just has one, it's just the URL, but often it has other things. Most likely it's gonna have these other things, meaning a rel and a type. And so what this means is it's gonna tell you if you perform a get to myapi.com/department/10/employees, you are going to get something that I'm going to shortcut name employees. And that rel right there, if you've probably seen things when you're building HTML, link rel equals style sheet, same idea. Again, it's all this very classic, simple, original HTTP stuff. It's just telling you, hey, if you want the style sheet for this page, here's the style sheet rel link. Here it's telling you, hey, if you want the employees for this department, here's the link. Not only that, I'm going to tell you what verb to use to get it. And that's it. Now, some of them are more complicated. We're not going to go down that road the whole way, but the simplest thing you could do is at least on every single thing you return back, you can give it itself, which seems kind of silly because you'd say, well, didn't I already go to /department/10 to get itself? Why do I need to return self? But lots of other times you're going to find that you get department/10 as a part of a response from some other endpoint. And so for it to give you the unique identifier so you can get the rest of the information or maybe a compound document about it along with things related to it can be really helpful. So if you want to just kind of dip your toe into hypermedia, just start adding just the self to every single thing you return back. So what we're digging into here is really this idea of APIs and the applications that they run on top of as state machines. I'm not going to dig too deep into what state machines are. Basically, it's a machine that has a state, and it allows you to know what the things that you can do in order to change the state. There's boundaries or actions, or however you want to think about it, where you do this thing, and then you make a transition from state 1 to state 2 or whatever. And so these hypermedia links are just directions for you about how to change that state. And there's lots of other really deep thinking we could get into, but we're not going to. But if you're an API nerd, you might be thinking about things like HAL and JSON LD. Yes, all that stuff's cool. Not going to get into it today, but there's a lot of deep thinking you can think there. So the big question is, should we as Laravel programmers aim for true HADOS or HADOS in all of our APIs? So this guy, Asbjørn Ulsberg, has a couple talks and articles on NordicAPIs.com, I think it is, where he's very, very strict, saying that we all need to be super, 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 super mindful of these original design specs of REST in designing all of our modern APIs. And at first, when I started watching and reading his stuff, I got really overwhelmed. I'll read this to you and you might understand why. Hard coding URIs in your documentation, and thus also in all the clients of your API, is a clear violation of the REST constraint that hypermedia must be the engine of application state. And what this means is he, and technically Roy Fielding as well, thinks you shouldn't have hard-coded URLs sprinkled all around your iOS clients or your mobile clients. Rather, they should just hit the original endpoint and from there discover what they can do. Now, it's not as if you're building artificial intelligence that's smart enough to always navigate the whole way down the tree. Instead, you're teaching your application, well, from this original one, I want this rel, and then the rel, that rel from that, and then that rel from that, depending on what they're clicking. So it's still using rels, which are sort of like the route shortcuts that we have, route aliases in Laravel. But it's still a very different way of thinking. So the big question is, should we aim for true HADOS in our apps? And I would just say probably not. It's a good thing for us to start thinking about introducing hypermedia as something that we take advantage of. It is not a requirement that we now need to feel, oh, I didn't make a real API if I don't have hypermedia. No, don't worry about that. And there's a really helpful diagram and concept called the Richardson maturity model. This is not the perfect description of how to think about everything in the API world, but at least it's worth kind of having this conversation. And what this guy basically said was, there is this basically continuum along which all APIs go on the way from level 0, which is the worst, up to the glory of REST. REST meaning a fully RESTful API. The swamp of POX means plain old XML. So it's the same thing as a POP, plain old PHP, or a POJ, plain old JSON or JavaScript. So what this would be is a completely unstructured, unstandardized thing that just sends JSON all over the place. That's the swamp of POX. Thankfully, our community is past that. Level 2 is, or 1 is organizing around resources, /dog/14. Thankfully, our community is also there. We kind of know that, but I've been, in the CodeIgniter world in the past where we didn't know that. Level 2 is using HTTP verbs. And so thinking about get versus put versus patch versus post versus delete. Again, thankfully, we as a community seem to get this pretty well. And then level 3 is actually moving to hypermedia controls for everything. And I would say the average, or the vast majority of Laravel APIs sit right there between 2 and 3. And I think that's just fine. I think we could be inspired by and consider hypermedia controls, but we don't need to stress about them. And there's actually this idea in JSON API, which we haven't touched yet, called gradual adoption, meaning any good spec is not going to require you to do all of it on day 1. Let's have a minimum of what you must do and everything else you can choose to do. And we'll dig into that a little bit more later. Okay, part 2. The state of APIs today. In my opinion, we are in the bad old days when it comes to API standardization. And I'm thinking about the bad old days where every single time we made a new app, speaking of CodeIgniter, we would rewrite auth from scratch because there was no standardized ways to do auth, not like it is in Laravel today, right? Every single time you make it up and you copy some of the good pieces from the last one, and everybody's got their own favorite one that they're currying from project to project, but it's a little bit different every time, and it totally sucked. And you basically end up in this state where your APIs now, then it was auth, and now it's our APIs. It's sort of like final two dot markdown. You know, it's like each time is sort of what worked the best last time, taking out the things like I didn't like last time, but it's my opinions versus the person who's the primary architect last time. It just changed around a little bit, and there's no really consistent standardization. In a talk that he gave about JSON API, Steve Klabnik said, every sufficiently advanced API contains an ad hoc, meaning kind of like made up on the go, informally specified implementation of some media type on top of JSON. What that means is basically the media types is if you've ever like typed content dash type colon space application slash JSON, that's a media type, and it defines things to the consumer and from the client about what the shape of the responses should look like. But application slash JSON is really, really, really loose. It just says, it's in JSON. That's it. That's all it specifies. And lots of other media types define much more stringent requirements about the shapes of things, but application JSON doesn't. And so what he's basically saying here is everybody, when they're building APIs, if there's any significance at all, they're building their own rules, but the rules are made up. They're not actually connected to anybody else's rules. And that's a bad thing. You know, application JSON leads to anger is one of the things that he said, because every time it's made up, you don't know actually what to expect. And this is leading me to think that APIs are really a bike shedder's paradise. It's like a kid in a candy store. There's so many choices, so many things that I get to bike shed on. If you're not familiar with bike shedding, it basically means wasting time and energy on marginal technical issues. It's around the idea that in organizations, in groups, people tend to focus the most on the things that matter the least because they're the easiest to kind of fixate on rather than the big and important problems. So what we do is basically spend all this time bike shedding on these little things because there's so many things that are not defined. And so my goal here is just to get us to think about stop wasting time bike shedding on our API standards. And that's why I love JSON API. So let's dig into what JSON API is. All right, so a tiny little bit of history. Ember and Rails sitting in a tree, KISSING, for the longest time. And Rails APIs were consumed by Ember. And Ember had this idea called Ember Data, where it was like the much better and much earlier predecessor of things like Vuex and Redux. It was a data store that was knowledgeable enough to take the responsibility for consuming the data from all the different endpoints that you had and kind of keeping it internally consistent, keeping it represented, keeping it updated. And if you're storing something from one request here and then another request pulls it in, it also will then update that store. And if you're looking for one resource, it's always represented in the same place. And it requires a very heavy contract between the Ember data, the Ember app, and then the API. And it got to the point where they were trying to do a better job of defining that API between Rails and Ember. And they were about to define it. And someone on that team said, wait a minute, if we're going to do all this work to define what we think the ultimate full stack REST app API is going to look like, why don't we define it in a way that's useful to other people as well? And they pulled out that project that was originally going to be the Ember and Rails communication standard, and they turned it into the JSON API standard. And so we kind of got the benefit of their work there. And it's a standard, like any standard, there's must and should and may. It's very long and it can be a little bit overwhelming to read. But I have read through this entire spec over the span of the last couple of weeks many, 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 many times. And if you're going to do JSON API, or even if you just have opinions about APIs, I would recommend reading through it at some point. You might be familiar if you've kind of dipped your toe in a JSON API a little bit with this structure, right? You've got a data key. Under that is going to be one or multiple things, and they've always got at least a type or an ID, and then sometimes they have attributes and relationships. But you might not be familiar with things about mushing together all the resources from compound documents in a flat included key. I'll get into this later. Or the content negotiation requirements of the specific error syntax that it has, or how to handle nested include directives or sparse field sets, or what the specific directives are around validation with creates and updates and deletes, or endpoints that are specifically for a relationship modification. I mean, these things, now granted, I don't want to overwhelm you because I'm going to get you clear on all these and which these you actually have to care about, but they're a little bit more than I think the folks who say, oh yeah, I know JSON API often go. And for those of you who don't be overwhelmed. It's going to be totally manageable. But for a lot of folks, when I've done these surveys saying, oh, what do you do to handle JSON API? I would say probably 50% of the people assume that I meant was an API that uses JSON. And then probably 25% of the people knew enough about JSON API just to really know this thing right here. So there's more, but don't worry, we're going to make it super approachable anyway. So as I think about JSON API, I built a list, and then I'm actually really grateful to Dan Gebhardt, who's one of the editors of JSON API, who gave me access to the slides for a talk he gave in October. It will be linked on my website that I link at the end. And he had a really great way of thinking about the two sets of requirements. One is document structure, so how your JSON is formatted, and one of them is HTTP standard. So I'm stealing that structure from him. And there's going to be some slides later I steal directly from him with attribution. So let's talk about document structure and JSON API. And again, remember, I'm going to give you kind of a rush job of teaching you all the basics of JSON API, and then I'm going to talk about why I think you should use it, and then we'll talk about implementation details. So every JSON API response is going to have an option. Basically, it's going to have all these at the root level optionally, and there's certain configurations you can't have. So for example, if you have data, you can't have errors. If you have errors, you can't have data, but you can have data included, So these are mix and match with various rules, but the simplest one is the one I just said. Basically, if it's a positive response with some data, it's probably going to have a data thing, and if it's a negative response with an error, it's probably going to have errors, and everything else is pretty flexible around there. So we're going to walk through all of them very quickly. Starting with the simplest to describe, which is Meta and JSON API. And so let's just get them off the plate. So JSON API, literally the only reason for it is to define which version you're using. And if you don't return this, it's fine. It's just going to assume 1.0, which is the current spec. Meta is if you want to add something. You can do anything you want as long as it's JSON. So if you don't have anything to add, just don't do Meta. So Meta and JSON API, you can kind of just wipe them off your plate. Let's talk about data. So the simplest possible return in data is a single object or a resource. And then the next simplest is an array of resources. And all of those are going to be represented by a resource object. So resource object starts as a resource identifier object. You can't get any simpler in this. And a resource identifier object is a type and an ID, and that's it. ID's got to be string, type's got to be a standardized thing that refers to that thing. So I tend to use basically table name, pluralize, lowercase, that kind of stuff. And then it's got some optional sections. Attributes, which is where you store all the, the properties or the columns or whatever. Relationships, which I'll show you how it's shaped, but it's information about the related items, comments on an article or whatever. Links is that hypermedia stuff. And then meta is, again, anything you want. Just like it was in the root, it's also meta here. Whatever random JSON pairs you want. And with attributes, it's very simple stuff. It's just JSON, title, greatest post ever, body, lorem ipsum. That's it. Relationships are a little more complicated, but each of them in this object has a key. The key is the name of the relationship. So again, it tends to be the exact same name as what we use on your Eloquent relationship. And then it's got data underneath it or whatever else, because this is now just a full object. And within that data, it either has one or multiple resource identifier objects. So that's actually really simple. Here's where it gets a tiny bit complicated. That never actually contains the full resource. That person, number 5, has been included into this request. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing them there. But we're only seeing the resource identifier object. And that is because the only time you get the full attributes of an item is when it's the primary item. It's one of either the primary or one of the primary things in data. Everything that's related only gets an identification in the relationship, only gets a type and a people, or a type and an ID, and then that's pointing to its existence in a flat array later, which I'll show you in just a second, which is where all those things are. And it seems a little complicated, but the benefit of this is, for example, if you have this person number 5 multiple times, because they both authored this article and then also authored a comment on this article, you don't have to have duplicates of that person's information. In both of those places, as both the author and the author of a comment, they'll be represented as type people ID 5. And then that information can be gathered from the client down in this next key, which is the included key. And so down at the bottom, if you have anything in the relationships, you're now going to have one entry. It's a totally flat array, one entry with all of the information you want that is that represents someone who is called in one of those relationships above. So like I said, person number 5 could be there multiple times up in relationships in different spaces, but all of them refer down to one entry in this occluded array, which has all the information we want about them. And this is where you could put links, for example, to itself so that we know how to get person number 5. Now I can guess it's /people/5, but I wouldn't have to guess because it'd be a link in there or whatever. So everything gets pulled out of there. So flattened and deduplicated. Links, it's just exactly what I've been showing you. Links is going to be hypermedia, but when you do links at the top level, you're also going to have, there's a convention around pagination. And this convention around pagination for JSON API, thankfully, is exactly the same convention that we get when we get paginated Laravel results. So by default, you're just getting the correct Laravel pagination stuff for free just because you're using Laravel. So you don't even have to think about that. And finally, errors. If anything goes wrong, you're not going to get data back. You're instead going to get an array back. And the array can have one or more items. And the items can have any combination of these keys, ID or links or status or code or title or detail or source or meta. And so source is containing references to the source, and I actually have not spent the time to really learn that one. I'm going to be totally honest with you, but it seems to me to be something about pointing to the pointers, and I don't know, it's not my world, so I've just ignored that one. But all the other ones are various ways of identifying information that would be useful to the consumer about how do I figure out more useful information about this error, including links. You could put a link to a page to explain that error to them that they can just send the user over or whatever. And so here's an example of what a very common representation would be from a Laravel space. You got a status and you got a title. And if you don't want to use an ID status, you don't have to. You can come up with a code or whatever. You can do your switches on that. So this is cool because it's actually very simple to just start structuring all of our errors this way. And then that's it. So on to part 2, the HTTP specs. Really quick on this one. There's 3 main things we want to think about here. Number 1 is content negotiation. Number 2 is verbs and status codes. And number 3 is the query parameters. Content negotiation, I'm going to keep super simple. All your clients should send requests with that content type, and all your responses should come back with that content type, which is application/vnd.api plus JSON. If you've seen application/JSON before, that's a generic one. If you see VND in a content type, that means it's a vendor, which means it's somebody outside of AINA came up with a suggestion, registered it officially, but they're considered a vendor. And what's the vendor name? Well, in this case, it's the vendor's name is API. That's they were able to get in as the vendor named API. And plus JSON means it's going to be in the JSON format. So in theory, and actually I think maybe even practice, there might be an application/vnd.google and .apple, although I didn't actually double check that. Verbs and status codes, the simplest thing is just use them the way they're meant to be used. And what this means is don't send back errors with a 200, don't delete something with a get, that kind of stuff. There is one note about status codes, and is one of the biggest breaking changes for maybe some people who think they're fully implementing JSON API, which is that if somebody requests a JSON API feature, for example, include or sort, and you don't support it, you don't just let it pass through, you throw a bad request. So you should be sniffing for just a few things, not a ton, and saying, oh, I don't support include, throw a bad request. That's it. And as you can see in this graph, which I also stole from Dan Gephardt, you can do all sorts of different HTTP calls to all sorts of different things, not just the resources themselves, but the relationships. Now, I'm not going to suggest, because I think it would be one of the most overwhelming things, that we all start using relationship modification endpoints. But if that piques your interest, there's a lot of really interesting ideas around the conventions of allowing you to modify relationships. For example, deleting an attachment or adding an attachment or changing an attachment or something like that through specific HTTP requests. And so if you've ever found yourself having to do non-restful, endpoints, as we call them, where you're like, oh, well, it's really kind of like add comment or whatever, you might end up finding that these are actually the best way to do something like that, to create a relationship between two things. And then finally, query parameters. So there's 5 query parameters that are reserved, 3 of which they're not just reserved, but it's defined how to use them, and 2 of which you can use however you want. So the include one defines when you're going to include related things. So this right here, where it says include equals author and comments.author, says give me the author as an included embed, and then also all the comments, and for all the comments, all of their authors. The sort one starts left to right, so sort first by created at, and then next by name, and then the minus in front of it, the dash, means descending, which I love this syntax because it's so much cleaner than other sort syntax I've used before. And for fields, this is for sparse field sets. So for example, if you're getting something back from the articles endpoint, but you also have the author attached, and you really only want the title and the body of the articles and the name of the person, then you can do this, and it's only going to return you back those 3. And so you might get like a lighter delivery and maybe even a cheaper SQL lookup. And then the 2 unopinionated ones are that you're going to use page for pagination if you use it, and if not, don't use it for something else. And you're going to use filter for filtering if you're going to use it, and if not, don't use it for something else. JSON API doesn't care how you use either of those. There is a recommendation, well, not a recommendation, there's an example in the JSON documentation that shows you using page a little differently than Laravel does. And if you like it, Spotsy has a package for that. But if you don't like it, the Laravel's way of default using pagination like this, where you don't get to define the page count, and you just get a page number and that's it, or like the per page count. This is also perfectly acceptable way within the JSON API spec. So Here's a really important note because you might be feeling overwhelmed right now. You don't have to fully adhere to a standard in order to learn from it. So there's multiple levels. One of them is keep writing the exact same APIs you're doing today with nothing learning from it. One of them is pull a couple pieces you like. For example, that whole sort equals, column, comma, negative column thing. I stole that from JSON API years ago because it's the best sort standard I've ever seen. And every API I write, including in my book, talks about it, even though those aren't always fully JSON API things. And then the next step is to do a close to JSON API, but not fully implementing JSON API, like don't follow the rules. The next step would be to do it, but to only do the minimum, right? All the things that say must, I will do, but all the things that say may, I won't do. And the next step would actually be to fully implement JSON API. So moving on. Why should I choose JSON API? You just told me about a whole bunch of things that are making it kind of overwhelming and a lot of stuff, hopefully not overwhelming, but there's a lot going on. Why would I actually use it? Well, let's start by asking the question of why not on a few things. Why not OpenAPI? Quite a few people have asked me that. OpenAPI is not actually an API standard, despite what I think a lot of people think. OpenAPI is an API documentation standard. And it used to be Swagger, which I think if it was still called Swagger, this confusion wouldn't be there because everyone knows that Swagger is for documenting APIs. So you can use OpenAPI to document a JSON API with no problem. So no problem. This is a more common one. Why not GraphQL? So first of all, they don't necessarily fulfill the same purpose, but I would say there's some definitely noticeable downsides of GraphQL that have been solved for ages in JSON API: pagination, cacheability, even just the unnecessary pain of new tooling. While we are talking about tooling that you're not currently using, 90% of it or more is just layers on top of Laravel's existing tooling. And I've had folks who I know who have been doing GraphQL and been swayed by the promise, but the amount of work for tooling and learning and teaching your team that it takes is definitely not insignificant. But also, JSON API is a graph. And every time I say include or relationship or compound document, just replace it in your mind with the word graph. And it's the same thing. Even to the point where in that talk I mentioned to you that Dan Gebhardt gave me the slides to, he actually, for a moment, replaced the slogan of JSON API with this kind of new idea of a slogan: JSON API, a specification for fetching and mutating a graph of data, which is first representing the fact that the JSON API folks are thinking of this as graph related. It's not a surprise at all once you start thinking about those relationships and those compound documents and the hypermedia. But additionally, they're thinking a lot about mutating that data, which I think a lot of other things, including GraphQL, haven't always thought as deeply about. If you're a big nerd, like I said, you might say, why not HAL or Siren or JSON LD or collection plus JSON? Those are all hypermedia formats, which means they're not full API formats. You couldn't use just that. You'd need that plus something else. And some of these, or maybe even all, can be used within JSON API because you can structure your hypermedia in JSON API differently, including using these formats. So don't worry about it. And you might be asking, why not HTTP2? Especially if you read Phil Sturgeon's blog. I love Phil. I think he's brilliant. But one of the blog posts he did recently, they basically said, we don't necessarily need things like JSON API as much anymore because this whole compound documents idea basically says it was designed to try and get as many resources as possible into a single request. And so HTTP2 is reducing the cost of having multiple requests. So why do we need the compound document thing anymore? Now, granted, Phil also has said a lot of things that are super pro JSON API, but some people might only fixate on that one article. The thing is, first of all, JSON API is a great standard even if you never use compound documents. Compound documents still can be very helpful even if you don't need them for the purpose of collecting them all into a single URL. And additionally, JSON API's forthcoming, it says experimental things can replace include with server push. And so they're actively developing JSON API 1.1 and further to have these ideas around server push built into it. So HTTP2 and JSON API can also play together very nicely. So once again, I'm going to steal from Dan because one of the primary focuses of his talk, which is really just a shorter part of mine, is why JSON API? What are the benefits of JSON API? And these were his big sections, and I'm just going to really zoom over each of these. And a link to these slides of his, unfortunately, there's no recording, will be in the show notes on the website that I share at the end. So remember at the beginning, one of the biggest things I said was stop bike shedding over API standards. And that's really the biggest thing, is just to pick a friggin' standard. But there's other benefits that we're going to get here. Shared conventions, shared tooling, standards-based best practices, plays well with others, and gradual adoption. So shared conventions and toolings are things around the fact that they're not the only ones that are using these conventions, and they're not the only ones that are using the tooling, because by using conventions that other folks use, they have the opportunity to share in tooling using, so for example, like I said, the pagination that comes out of Laravel by default is perfectly in line with it. So you don't have to build new pagination. You can just use Laravel's pagination. And there's this existing front-end libraries for every major front-end framework you can think about that already assumes that your backend's going to be shaped like JSON API and makes it a lot easier for you to do very rich stuff there. And there's just a lot of different things that you can do based on the fact that there's lots of other people using this same standard. But the standard isn't just a standard, it's a very good standard. One of the things I love about Laravel is that when people join the Laravel community, they might not know about design patterns and solid and all this kind of stuff, or even good OOP. But in order to learn to use Laravel, those things are all baked into Laravel. And so you're learning about design patterns or interfaces or whatever else it ends up being by using Laravel. And people realize that learning Laravel actually teaches them more about architecture than stuff that they've learned that's specifically trying to teach them about architecture. And the same thing is true. There's so many fantastic best practices in API design, including RFCs from the actually official standards that are baked into JSON API. Plays well with others. Like I mentioned, it's connected to lots of other tooling and stacks and stuff like that. And finally, this whole idea about gradual adoption, which I talked about before. Remember, gradual adoption is the idea that lots of places of JSON API say must, but many other ones say you may do X, Y, Z. Now, once you say I will, then you must, right? So it says if you're going to use the include query parameter, you must do ABC, but you don't have to use the include query parameter if you don't want to. All right, next section, JSON API tooling in Laravel. So this was what my original talk was going to answer for you. Which tool should I pick? This repo, which I completely forgot to put online to make public before this talk, but for anybody who's watching the playback and for all of y'all, as soon as I get off this one, I will go make it public. What I started doing there, they're not done, they're not things that you can go and copy, but I started basically, there's 4 branches. There's a master branch, which is just a README, and then there's 3 branches, one for each of these tools, where I started building it out. And how difficult it was to fully comply with JSON API and those tool sets define how well built out it is. So there's to-dos in there. I'm going to keep working on it. People can do pull requests if they want to help make it better for me as a good resource for folks. But you're going to be able to go there later to see all of that. So that and that website that I built are going to give you the ability to have the resources to kind of actually see practically what the hands-on steps looks like. And the guide that I wrote actually has like step-by-step guides that are very rudimentary right now, but I'll keep fleshing them out. So lots of, without further ado, let's move on to our 3 tools. And I'm actually going to say all 3 of them first. The first one is using Laravel's Eloquent resources. Just them, no additional, well, a little bit additional tooling. The second one is to use Fractal. And then the third one is to use a package called Laravel JSON API. So let's start with the simplest one, move on to the medium simplest one, and then go on to the most complicated one. So Eloquent resources for JSON API. If you're not familiar with Eloquent resources, they're basically simple PHP classes that you can do using PHP artisan make resource space article. If you have not worked with them before, there's tutorials and videos all over the internet about them, and the docs are great, where they get the resource injected to them as this resource, and then they have a toArray method. And when you use them in your APIs, you basically return either one or a collection of these resources, and toArray is called on them when it's converted to JSON. So the simplest format most people use is just an array that basically has like key values of a whole bunch of things. So let's say you wanted to take this really complicated article and all you wanted was the title and the body. Well, your toArray method would just basically return, title, arrow, this resource title, and then body, arrow, this resource body, and that's it. And that's how they're used most commonly. But you can use them to build other structures. And as you can see here, this structure that we can build here is this basic resource shape that we are going to get from JSON API. So we're already pretty far here. It's in data, the attributes are in attributes, we're good to go. I would say that if you're using anything in these first 2 sections, which is going to be either the Laravel Eloquent resources or the second one, which is Fractal, you should definitively, unquestionably be using Spotsy's Laravel Query Builder package, I think it's called, because not only is it really convenient because it simplifies the process of building in lots of very common API tasks that we do, but it does so in ways that are natively the JSON API way of doing it. So for example, the way that this package allows you to handle includes gives you that question mark include equals whatever syntax that JSON API defines, and they built it the JSON API way, and then it hooks right into Eloquent. when it does sorts, they built it to use the syntax inspired by JSON API. So whether or not you're intending to do a fully JSON API compliant thing, if you're using Spotsy's Query Builder, you're already on the way there because they used that. Remember this whole like shared tooling, shared conventions thing? They built it into theirs. And so whether or not you're doing JSON API, you're doing JSON API inspired APIs already purely by doing that. And that means if you're moving towards JSON API, using this package gets you quite a way down the way. So you can do here, you say, I'm going to get all of the articles. I'm going to allow them to potentially include author and comments. So that would be, question mark include equals author, question mark includes equals comments. And I'm allowing them to sort by these two columns. I'm going to paginate it, and then I'm going to wrap it around with Laravel Eloquent resources. And this is the simplest possible response. And this is super easy. Between the really rudimentary Eloquent resources and this package, you have got quite a few of the document structure aspects built in super easily, until you need to build relationships. Now, I'm praying that somebody's going to come along and tell me, oh, that's actually solved and you just didn't find it. But so far, the process of flattening all the included things down to one flattened thing down at the bottom, which is pretty foundational for how relationships are supposed to work in JSON API, is really painful to do in Eloquent resources. I've got it 80 to 90% of the way in that example repo I sent y'all. And I'm going to continue working on it. I've got some more ideas. It might be something that somebody should make a package for, but I'm not sure. But I just want to say this whole process, especially when you get in nested things, not just author and comments, but what about comments.author? It can get very complicated in there. So I would say my conclusion about Laravel Eloquent resources, it's good for simple applications. It's lots of work for a full JSON API implementation. With the Spotsy Query Builder, you can get very far, but the hardest thing to get in the basic document structure is flat included. And as you can see here, I'm going to build this little chart for all three of them and the things that they give relative to each other. So you get basic data structure, pagination filters, includes, nested includes, sparse field sets, which is the whole thing where you can say, question mark fields, for articles equals just these two. You get that for free with Spotsy's Query Builder. Love it. And easy sorting. But the easy flat include syntax and all the rest of these errors, content negotiation, relationship routes, auditing your requests for JSON API compliance and throwing 400s if they're not compliant, all this stuff, we don't have any of those. So those things need to be built out on top of it. If you want to use it, again, once this API, this resource is available, then you'll go to github.com/titanco, JSON API examples, and then the Eloquent resources branch. Links to all available later. All right, solution 2, Fractal. So in the past, I've often balked at Fractal. Fractal has been this amazing, very, very, very powerful and rich and robust tool that has been the ultimate in doing this and doing that and passing them together in the very classic, style of the PHP developers not in the Laravel world. And interesting, it was built by Phil Sturgeon, who's a wonderful and lovely human being. It's hosted by the League, which has a whole ton of really great packages. But one of the things I think is most common from packages built by wise PHP people outside of the Laravel world is that they tend to be more difficult to use than I like them to be. And the bridge on top of this that is called Fractalistic, which is something that Spotsy put out, there's this like a Spotsy Love Fest in here. They have a package called Fractalistic that really changes the API of it. And if you use the Laravel Fractal package from Spotsy, it's a bridge for Fractal that pulls it into Laravel, registers it, and pulls in Fractalistic. And all of a sudden, working with Fractal is not nearly as miserable because it's going to feel much more Laravel-y. So if you look at this doesn't look that much different than the stuff we were writing beforehand. We're using this Fractal helper, which makes it really simple and clean. We're newing up the transformer very similarly to how we were newing up the Eloquent resource. We're passing in this with resource name thing, which allows us to define kind of you remember the whole thing I said about, everything I use the table name to define whether this is an item of articles or an item comments. And I'll show you that respond JSON API. That's something I made up a little bit later. But basically that is a macro that I made that sets the content type to application/vnd dot API plus JSON. So simple stuff, nice and clean. And the transformers have these ideas of includes built in by default. The available includes is an array. You can put in articles and comments there. The transformer is just what we're used to. And there is this kind of a little bit of convention that's a little bit weird to work with, where on your transformer, every include has to have an include whatever thing defined in here. But it's pretty simple. You do this collection and pass in the things, or you do this item if it's just one of them. So I would say Fractal is with Fractalistic and with with this Laravel Fractal package, it's so much easier to use than it used to be in the past. It's much less of a pain. It is a little bit different. It's not quite as simple in Laravel as Eloquent Resources it is, but it's not nearly as different from the Laravel way of working as it used to be. It's good for some more complex things than Eloquent Resources default, especially if you're a Fractal fan. I would work with it. There's still a lot of work to be done. You can see from the checklist I'll show you in a second about the things it doesn't do. But one thing it does that Eloquent Resources doesn't is that you get that flat included concept for free. The JSON API serializer that comes out of the box with Fractal does that whole flat included thing for you. And so that's one reason where if you take a look at this, it's got all the same checks, but it's also got that easy flat include syntax. And so if you combine Laravel Fractal from Spotsy and then the Spotsy query builder, you get all those things a little bit more easily than Eloquent Resources. And then boom, you get easy flat included syntax for free. So much further down the road, but we're still missing all those other pieces. That JSON API serializer is just a serializer. It's not a full JSON API syntax. So if you wanted to use that, you can go check this out, which again will be linked later. So our last one is a specific package defined for doing Laravel JSON API. Now, interestingly, the name and the history of this package is there's a framework agnostic JSON API package by somebody called Neomerx, I think. And this package that I'm talking about was originally just a Laravel bridge. It's one of those things where someone says, oh, it's a little bit of a pain to new it up. I'll make a service provider that news it up for you. I'll bind it into the container, and then maybe I'll make like a helper or a facade for you, and that's it. You know, one of those classic bridges that does very little, but just make it a little bit more Laravel-y or easy for Laravel people to do it. But very quickly, it came to a life of its own, and now it's so different, or so many layers on top of the original, that I think I saw a proposal where in the next version that they're working on right now, they're actually talking about the idea of pulling out some of that original Neomerx one. I don't know if all of it or some of it, but it's really come to have its own opinions, and those opinions are actually moving in the Laravel direction. So I even think like in 6 months to a year, this one might feel a little bit more Laravel than it does today. It's gonna feel a little more overwhelming right now. Every single time you create a new resource, you're gonna have these ideas of schemas. You're gonna have the ideas of adapters. So schemas are sort of like transformers, but there's a lot of very context-specific stuff here. You know, this get ID from that resource name, or that method name, I would assume it's going to get me the ID, but it turns out it actually just gets me the column. Okay. Get attributes is my transform or my toArray method. Okay. Get relationships is a little bit more complicated because it's using all these kind of magic constants, but as you read through it, it seems relatively clear, and those are auto-generated for me. So I get a self link for free. I get a related link for free. I get these relationship links for free. So that's not that bad. And then the adapters are a little bit more weird. Including the fact that you're defining these relationships using sort of eloquent-y syntax, but it's not quite eloquent. But again, once you learn it, it makes sense. So there's definitely a steeper learning curve here. But let me show you this chart in a second. It's a steep learning curve because it works so differently than what we're all used to. However, it is the best way to get even close to full JSON API. Now, granted, this list might not be all the things. I didn't actually compare this list right here against every single thing that is a must in the JSON API spec, but that's a much different list there. And you get so many things for free out of the box with this one. And it's basically, you know, the errors are automatically captured and handled. Those routes are bound. And all these things, including a whole testing helper framework that's out of the box. Now, again, they're in the middle making a lot of changes. So maybe go look at the issues right now to see if you want to wait until they make those changes. But it might be months before they're done with it. You can go take a look at my repo again to see an example of using it. But also, there is this tool made by a Laravel guy named Josh Justice, which is howtojsonapi.com, and he shows how to do JSON API, really great tutorials in a whole bunch of different contexts, and one of them is Laravel. So if you go to this URL, it's going to be a step-by-step blog post introducing you on how to set up an entire app from scratch using that Laravel JSON API package. Now, I have much more rudimentary blog posts doing the same thing with Eloquent and resources that are going to be linked in that resource, but this one right here is great. I didn't need to add a third one because he already did it really well. So if you're interested in that one, go check it out and see what it looks like to work with it. Again, steeper learning curve, but so much more implemented by using it. So let's breeze through a few other API concerns. Not a lot of depth with any of these. With auth, you know, we already heard about airlock today. You know about passport probably, so you can use OAuth for that. You want to think about auth, but there's nothing JSON API specific about this. Caching, I do want to have a note, because REST APIs are supposed to be stateless and supposed to be cacheable. You could cache database requests. And if you go look at the Fractal branch in mine, I showed an example of what it looks like to, inside of your controller, specifically generate a unique key for every request that's coming in and do cache right around the database lookup. And there's some value in that. But often with APIs, because they're supposed to be designed to be cacheable, the better solution is to do actual full HTTP request caching. So you're not caching database lookups. You're literally basically looking at the URL, maybe like sorting it so it's at least always in the same direction or whatever. And then you're matching that against the full HTTP response. And then that's the lookup. You can do that at the PHP level. There's a couple different packages. Spotsy has one and Joseph Silver has one. But you can also do external intermediary caches using something like Varnish or Cloudflare. So a well-written API will be able to take the full incoming request and cache it against the full outgoing response and not even worry about internal caching. In theory, there's probably still some work you need to do there, but think about the different options you have there. All right, so things to think about after the talk. Relationship endpoints is one. Go take a look at how JSON API treats those things. Go take a look at Helios, and hypermedia. You might find it's actually interesting. It took a little while for me to grok it. I will probably end up doing some streams digging into building a richer Helios API and then a client that consumes it to really kind of experience what it's like and figure out where the edges are that make it difficult. So check out those streams if I do it. I haven't talked at all about e-tags. There's a great blog post that's linked in my my resource I'll share later about e-tags and how to handle cache control and expires. And what these are basically things you can do to tell the client how long they should cache it. And so, for example, if you can imagine having an app that is going to be making these calls, well, your server might have optimized sending it, but the app still has to download it. And let's say it's an app designed for people with slow internet. It doesn't, even if you've got a fast cache, it doesn't want to have to download it all the time. And so there's these things called e-tags and or cache control or expires that allow those apps to basically not have to re-download something when it hasn't changed. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to learn there. JSON schema is this idea where you're actually going to define the type of all your JSON things. And so by defining that type, you can pass that definition down to your client side, and your client side can do validation. You're almost teaching your validation rules to the client side. So the client side can validate first before it even hits the backend. So that's super interesting. HTTP to server push, both in and outside of JSON API. And then the whole concept of JSON API 1.1. Go check out Dan Gebhardt's talk, and he goes into it a little bit in his slides there. And hopefully one day he'll give that talk again and we can get a recording of it. So TLDR of this talk, and this is probably not the perfect TLDR, but that's fine. API standards are great. JSON API is a great standard. It's one of the only standards, to be honest. Gradual adoption means there's no judgments. I'm not going to be looking at your APIs and saying, oh, well, you didn't add hypermedia, therefore you're not a real programmer. And if you don't adopt something in the JSON API standard, just give an error if it's asked for. And I would say API light, you're going to use either Eloquent Resources or Fractal together with Spotsy Query Builder. And if you want to do full JSON API, I would recommend working with the Laravel JSON API package. So these slides will be up here in just a couple of minutes, plus some directions on how to do the different implementations, some lists, all the graphics are up here. And as I am inspired over the next few days, I'll probably continue building there. Also links to that GitHub repo as soon as I make it public, all here, mattstauffer.com/JSON-API. That's it for today. Thank you all so much.